Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 4 of our quarterly Teachers Intensive. And we are continuing on from where we were last time, and that was teaching in the theme of the kingdom of God. This particular lesson comes from the middle unit and the last lesson, and I would draw your attention here to the fact that we are teaching from Matthew 24, which I recognize is not the first passage mentioned. But if you are familiar with what's called the Olivet Discourse, you would know this comes mainly from Matthew 24, but not exclusively. I say mainly because the longest treatment of the discourse is in Matthew 24, and it's the first that we arrive at, canonically speaking, since Matthew's the first gospel. Notice the title of the lesson, the disciples long for Jesus' coming, but the first text that we are given is Luke 17. Now, Matthew 24 also parallels with Mark 13, which is the same material, just shorter, and Luke 21. But you can clearly see this is not Luke 21. So the context of Matthew 24, Luke has broken apart, and he has spread that out between different chapters, Luke 17 and then Luke 21, which is a common thing for Luke to do with Matthew's material. He does the same thing with the Sermon on the Mount. The operative title I would give to the lesson would be that the kingdom has arrived, not is arriving. Now, I realize much of what I'm going to say from this point on may very well challenge your view of eschatology. I've made it very clear. I'm not a dispensationalist. I used to be, but I'm not anymore. But I try not to be dogmatic about that. And I try to be humble with respect to embracing other people's opinions and not always trying to challenge that unless there's a friendly collegial discussion going on there. And maybe, I have the freedom to do that. But I respect anyone's opinion on what's going to go on here or at that time, because I fully recognize I may be wrong. So having said that, and to not gild the lily any further, moving on, teaching it from the best way I understand it, I think one very clear passage that brings a serious challenge to the idea of the pending arrival of the kingdom, though I recognize there is some tension in what we call the now but not yet. We recognize that Jesus has pronounced the arrival of the kingdom, starting with the opening of the first gospel written, Mark chapter 1, verses 14 through 15. Repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, not is still pending its arrival in the future. So it arrived at the time when Jesus began to preach about its arrival at the beginning of his public ministry. And of course, from previous lessons that I've taught you with respect to the parables, I think we see some very good and clear evidence there that the concept of the kingdom of heaven as taught from the parabolic framework that Jesus gives it is meant to be seen as a work that was ongoing over the centuries from the exile back to the time of Messiah's arrival and the inauguration of the kingdom, which of course is still growing using those parabolic formulas of the seed of the mustard seed that was planted and growing, and of course the lump of yeast or leaven in the bread still permeating. But the initial phase of harvest for the kingdom and those being gathered in as citizens of the kingdom began then. I don't think there really can be any dispute with respect to that. And we are waiting for the culmination of the kingdom with the king's final arrival. But that, I think, is also not to be seen in the sense of him ruling and reigning from Jerusalem per se, because heaven and earth are going to be united together per the final chapters of John's vision in the Revelation. But anyway, Jesus makes it very clear when he says the kingdom of heaven is not coming with something observable, meaning at the moment when he says these words, these people were expecting the kingdom to come clearly out of the clouds. And Jesus is saying that's not going to happen, nor will anyone say, see here or there, and there you'll find the kingdom. So you can't really point to a spot on the map and say, there's where the kingdom is. Instead, you must understand the kingdom is present tense, not will be, is in your midst. So in this very short passage, Jesus, I think, has made it very clear the kingdom has already arrived and is continuing to grow. So that needs to permeate our understanding moving forward in the verses of Luke 17, what Jesus is saying here, because again, Luke is taking material from Matthew 24, which if we've only read Matthew 24, we might think all of that pertains to what we would call the end times and is yet still future to us. But Luke takes that material and breaks it apart, and he begins to speak about it using some of that material in a different vein. But we need to appreciate why he's creating the dichotomy there. So one thing that becomes clear here, I think, are these three different groupings that I give it of inevitable destruction a narrow window of escape, and more importantly, this generation. That cannot be underscored enough. That being said, Jesus brings attention to the fact that just as in the days of Noah, so will be in the days of the Son of Man. People will be eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage until the day, or I'm sorry, people went on eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage until the day Noah boarded the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. So obviously, this is a time of judgment. We might think, well, that kind of judgment is worldwide and cataclysmic in the sense that creation is ended for a new creation to come on the other side of that. Such has to be a future judgment because since the days of Noah, that has not happened again. However, much of those references to Day of the Lord judgments in the Old Testament are seen to be a moment when the heavens and the earth, the entire cosmos, are affected. They are discombobulated in the sense that God is going to shake everything up in this incredibly violent, turbulent way. And yet they seem to be a typological finger pointing forward to the great day of the Lord when this final act of judgment will occur. But yet much of the judgment that's being described in those moments and these different panels that these prophets are giving us pertain to cities and kingdoms when those days of the Lord judgment were seen in the same concept of Noah's flood with inevitable destruction that could not be escaped, and there will not be any single person who will be unaffected. But when we march those through the actual annals of history, what we see is that it was not the decimation of a kingdom in the sense that every person was destroyed like it was in the days of Noah with a worldwide flood. It was a torrential outpouring of God's judgment in the sense that a kingdom was permanently affected by that. People marched off into exile, permanent slavery, and exile and so forth. And we're not just talking about the peoples of Israel, but other kingdoms as well. But then again, they may have continued to limp on and exist for centuries yet after that, until eventually they wound up slowly fizzling out of existence in the concept of human history or concourse of human history, or maybe are still present to this very day. That being said, Jesus is talking about a moment of destruction, and he's framing it up the same way, say, a Jeremiah would or an Ezekiel would, and yet life for those peoples who are the targets of those judgments continued onward. So it's possible then we can scale this down and actually look at it from the perspective of a great moment of terrible judgment, but yet life will continue on after that, and these people will continue on, but it will be a life-altering, forever generational defining moment of judgment. More to say after that, or after this as we continue to embellish. Because then he goes on in verse 29 to say, and on the day that Lot left Sodom, and fire and sulfur rained from heaven. Now notice he parallels these two together. World-ending cataclysmic flood, or I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not saying I believe this, but there are others who would scale Noah's flood down to a more regional kind of event. And that would put it a little bit more on par with what happens here in Sodom and Gomorrah. Just throwing that out there as a scholarly perspective, because this is a regional thing with respect to Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain being destroyed. Obviously, the earth was not taken away in that, or I should say taken up in that. Now, the reason why this is important is because here we have Matthew in Matthew 24, which again, oftentimes gets conflated with being an end times concept, using the very same language because he's describing the very same thing, this inevitable moment of destruction. But if Luke is talking about the arrival of the kingdom has already having happened, and now he's talking about judgment that's going to be coming very soon in the framework of what Jesus is talking about in the larger concept of Luke's gospel, we need to appreciate how that intersects with Matthew. And in the larger context of Luke 17, with what immediately precedes this moment, it seems that Jesus is talking about this with respect to the faithfulness and obedience of Israel. And we have the story of 10 lepers who were cleansed, but yet only one of those lepers actually came back to thank Jesus. And the rest just went about their way, which kind of seems to be a parody of what's going on with the larger concept of Israel, who are seeing these miracles and hearing these teachings, and yet there seems to be such a small response on the part of those who are actually recognizing the times of what's going on here. And because of that, Israel as a nation seems to be on a one-way collision course with Rome, and it's going to lead to their inevitable destruction. So I adopt more of a partial preterist approach to this. And with that comes the understanding that these passages from Luke 17 and 21 and a very large portion of Matthew 24 all coincide with what happens in AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem. And I think it's very hard to shake that concept when you consider Luke's treatment of this material, breaking it apart in Luke 17, and then saves the rest of it for Luke 21 and what happens with Jesus' disciples drawing his attention to the temple and the beauty of the buildings. Now we go back to Luke 17 when he says, I tell you, on that night, two will be in one bed, one will be taken and another will be left. I would seriously challenge any concept of trying to attach this to the rapture. People have a tendency to look at this and say there's very clear proof of a rapture-like event happening where you have two people sharing space together, and in a moment, one is taken away in an unsuspecting rapturous-like event. But the idea here is more so the concept of everybody working and doing things up until the moment when this time of judgment comes. And then when judgment does come, a person who is out in the field is going to be taken by the captors, by the people who are bringing judgment. Again, in the vein of a day of the Lord judgment in the Old Testament, where God is guiding an army to come and bring his heaven and earth upending judgment to a particular nation group who has offended him, and the time has come for their comeuppance to be paid. And he's using the armies of other nations to exact his vengeance. And when that happens, none of these conflagrations end with just the full decimation of a kingdom, and then that's it. Rather, instead, spoils are taken and slaves are exacted as part of this. And so the concept of two being asleep in the bed and one taken, or one at the grind mill and one taken, is to say that the person in the bed and the grind mill taken away are those who are going to be taken away as slaves, which very easily fits right into the picture of what happens when Rome comes to destroy Jerusalem. And then they take thousands of slaves back with them to Rome, and then send thousands more to work into the mines and various other places they deport them to for the rest of their natural lives. Because Jesus also is seen saying this very thing in Matthew 24, 2 men will be left in the field, one will be taken, 2 women at the grinding stone, one taken and one left. So it would seem that what we do have here very clearly is a moment of inevitable destruction. And now we go over to this concept of narrow window of escape. When Luke in 17 says, on that day, a man will be on the housetop, whose belongings are in the house, and he must not go down to get them. Likewise, the man who is in the field must not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Don't need to read it again from Matthew 24. It's the same thing. The reason why I would say this speaks more so to the concept of not rapture, but instead escaping judgment, is because, number one, we clearly see that Jesus is working from what they have constructed before them in their day. The easy reference to the 4-chambered household that any Israelite would have been living in. And with that, a good portion of that house is open space up on the roof, and that most of their possessions would be in the house beneath the roof. And so if a man is up on top of the house doing work or enjoying leisure time or whatever the case might be, and sees that judgment is nigh, or better yet, that the armies that are going to be surrounding them soon are coming to take them away, that he should run, escape, and don't worry about going down to the house to grab as many possessions as he can, because this torrential flood of God's judgment is going to be coming so swiftly, as it was in the days of Noah, as it was in the days of Lot, when Sodom was overthrown so quickly that Lot didn't have time to gather his belongings. He had to flee now, or else he would lose his life. Hence Jesus's reference to Lot's wife. So what sense does that make if we're talking about being raptured up? Again, I'm not going to continue to belittle the concept of rapture. I just want to make sure we're understanding the dichotomization between what Jesus is saying here and what other constructs have been overlaid on top of this that seem to try to make the scripture fit that theological construct. So moving over here to this generation, because there will be some who escape, and the idea would be, as Jesus has preached to them, the warning signs of what was coming, which only this generation would be able to perceive, that they should respond accordingly. That once they see these things begin to blossom forth, like the leaves that come about on the fig tree, and you know that the figs will be soon behind. You know that summer is going to be close on its heels. You know that judgment is going to be happening very soon when these signs begin to show up, which I'll go into a little bit more detail on the bottom of the screen in these black boxes. But Luke says in Luke 17, but first it's necessary that the Son of Man suffer and that he be rejected by this generation before these things can happen. Now, it seems a little silly to say he must be rejected by this generation, but thousands of years must intervene between this moment of his rejection before all the stuff that I just told you about is going to happen. But it's also said here in Matthew 23 that precedes and, of course, goes into or builds upon which Matthew 24 is built upon. Jesus is castigating the Pharisees and, of course, all the other towns who have rejected him. And he says, truly, I tell you, all these things will come on this generation. I don't have time to go into trying to explain all the mental gymnastics that goes into attempting to justify the idea that the generation being spoken of here is the generation present on the earth at the time when all of the judgment of Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, and the entirety of Revelation unfold, rather than the plain and simple reading of the text is this generation that Jesus is speaking to. This generation has to be held accountable for the blood of all the prophets, from Abel to Zechariah, who was slain before the altar, and ultimately the slaying of God's Son, as has been told in parable form immediately before this. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place, which notice here, this in verse 34, is after Jesus is spoken about many of these cosmic level signs and various things that speak of a day of the Lord like judgment. And if it's this generation, then it can clearly allude only to the events of AD 70 and the destruction of the temple, Jerusalem, and the carting away of Israel off into the diaspora. So looking a little bit more at Luke 17 in his first black box, they ask, where, Lord? And he says, with this rather enigmatic encoded language, where the corpse is, there the vultures will also be gathered. But many study Bibles will show that in Greek, this will also mean eagles, which could be perhaps a veiled reference to the standards of every Roman legion, because that was their symbol. In both senses, eagles and vultures are predatory birds, eagles taking live prey, vultures often more so scavenging off of dead prey. But the idea is that in either sense, these are birds that eat flesh, eat meat. And he alludes to the fact that there will be corpses. So where the dead bodies are, there the eagles will be gathered. What happens in AD 70 but the complete destruction of Jerusalem? And of course, there are mounds of dead bodies, literally people who are being crucified to the walls of houses due to the lack of wood to make enough crosses to make examples of those people who tried to rebel against Rome. So when Rome descended in AD 67 through 70 in a 3.5 year siege that eventually resulted in the destruction and annihilation of the city and temple itself, there was plenty of dead bodies and carnage around, with the eagles having descended very clearly there. But Jesus uses this in Matthew 24 as well. So notice this, if Luke 17 seems to be alluding to a different concept, then that portion of Matthew also has to be alluding to the same idea. Matthew 24, here many people would say, well, this seems to be a little bit more poignant to the concept of a yet future event with respect to the idea of the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, which most interpreters would agree this seems to be the moment of Antiochus Epiphanes' desecration of the temple, when he put there a statue of Zeus in the most holy place, and of course desecrated the altar with the offering up of swine on it. That being said, the basal concept of the destruction and decimation of the temple is what's operative here. It doesn't have to be a complete one-for-one here of the idea of the Antichrist creating a statue of himself and putting that in the temple that's yet to be built in Jerusalem in some future context. Might happen, but it seems the Bible is actually teaching something a little different when you take into consideration all of these passages. Because when we parallel this with Luke 21, which is the Olivet discourse of Luke's gospel, he removes abomination of desolation and instead makes it very plain. When he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize its desolation has come near. then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Again, what Jesus is saying here with respect to, remember Lot's wife. When you're up on the roof, don't go down and get your stuff. Get out of here, because the imminent destruction of the city is coming. And granted, the destruction didn't happen for 3.5 years. But that would not be enough of a detractor to say it couldn't be speaking about that, because when they laid siege to the city, anyone who tried to leave then would be killed. So the idea is, when they are far enough off in the distance that you can see them, but they have not yet fully surrounded the city, make haste now. Get out of here, because once they encircle the city, you're done. You're done, because Jesus knows that when Rome comes, it will not end in any other way other than the full destruction of the city and the people. So the disciples long for Jesus's arrival. And of course, this does in some way point to the idea of Jesus coming in the future. But I think a proper understanding of all of this would be better yet seen in the idea of the kingdom having arrived and is not yet arriving. And because of what has happened before, we can appreciate this is going to happen perhaps on some scale yet again in the future. But it doesn't have to be seen primarily from the perspective of dispensationalism. All right, I would love to answer questions on that, but I can't in this virtual space. So we're just going to have to move on to temple. All right. Sorry. This lesson coming as the last lesson in the opening unit of this quarter, Jesus over all, from John 10 and Hebrews 1. So John 1, well, let me refer to the title here, my operative title being The Glory of the Lord, but riffing off of Ezekiel to an extent. Because in John 1, we are told that the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, or tabernacled amongst us, and we observed his glory. Glory is not just the shimmering visage of Jesus on the mountain of transfiguration. It's that in some respects, but it's other respects also. What I mean by that is we look to the concept of God's glory descending from the summit of Mount Sinai into the tabernacle itself when Moses sets it up, and now he wants to invite those people who are consecrated for the job into his presence to worship him and to represent the nation before him. And of course, take up the larger responsibility of helping intercede for the nations as the nations are reconciled through Israel's mandate. That being said, it's fire and smoke up on the mountain to brilliant, beautiful light that's so bright and magnificent and palpable that people can't even enter into the tabernacle. And that happened all in the span of maybe minutes, seconds even. So the idea is, it's not all about the physical appearance so much as the idea, or I guess I should say, qualify that a little bit more with light and brilliance and so forth, as much as it is just the idea of God's presence. That's the idea of glory. So Ezekiel 1, here he is by the Kabar River, and he sees the appearance of brilliant light. So yeah, John in John 1 does allude to the idea of what happened on the Mountain Transfiguration, as he does in his first epistle. But I hope you get what I'm saying by that. Brilliant light all around. And it was like that of a rainbow and a cloud on a rainy day. And this was the appearance of the likeness of God's glory. So this is something of a temple vision here. But God's throne is no longer in the most holy place in Ezekiel's vision, as it was supposed to be per the construction of the temple itself. Instead, it has now approached him in exile. So that being said, God's glory and his temple / throne presence is mobile. It sets up a lot of the themes that will be present in John's gospel. But moving forward in John 2, combining it with John 10, we have John recording for us the instance of Jesus cleansing the temple at the beginning of the gospel rather than in the Passion Week, when he speaks to the idea of destroying the temple and he will raise it up in 3 days. But obviously he's speaking about his body, tying this over here back to John 1. And then in John 10, when he is actually physically in the temple in Solomon's colonnade, we have the Jews attempting to try to throw rocks at him because of his proclamation of who he is. But notice this happens to be at the time of the Feast of Dedication, what we better know as Hanukkah. That happens to come as an additional feast added in during the time of the intertestamental period of between Malachi and the beginning of Matthew, namely during the time of the Maccabees, when the Seleucid Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes had desecrated the temple for a period of 3.5 years. And by virtue of that, he not only outlawed being Jewish and any representation or expression of that religion, but even shut the doors of the temple and for a period of years prevented people from being able to properly worship there. When they fought the stronghold of the Greeks, or I should say, fought the Greeks away from the stronghold of Jerusalem and were able to capture the city and take the temple once again, they wanted to rededicate the temple by first purifying it, and they wanted to reignite the lamps, but they did not have enough oil to fill all the lamps and keep it burning perpetually. And that led to the miracle event of Hanukkah, when it continued to burn for a period of 7 days, hence the 7-day observance of this. But the idea and the reason why it's called the Feast of Dedication is because it's the dedication of the temple. So you connect this back to John 2 and to John 1, the idea of Jesus speaking about him being the temple, and John backing this up by first commenting on the fact that God's glory has come to tabernacle amongst us in the form and person of Jesus. And we connect this to Ezekiel 10, where he says the glory of the God of Israel was above them, and it stopped at the entrance to the eastern gate of the Lord's glory. So yet again, he is watching as the Lord's glory is about to depart from the tabernacle. But with respect to John 2 and 10, riffing off of John 1, and again, connecting this as we are to Ezekiel, in Ezekiel's passages, we see the departure of God's glory, for then at the end of his scroll, the subsequent return of God's glory. But the return of God's glory is actually happening here in John 1, John 2, and 10. That's the actual moment of what he's speaking about, with the presence of God's glory standing in the vicinity of this new temple. But the new temple is actually him. It's not the building that was built 5 centuries earlier by that generation of Jews, and certainly not a new temple to be built in the future. Now moving down to the right side of the bottom of the screen, we have John 19, where we have Jesus carrying his cross by himself, and then he goes to the place that is called the skull, or in Aramaic, Golgotha. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because there is an argument to be made that if this is Jerusalem, that here is the Mount of Olives. I don't know why I put an A there. I think I was trying to make a snow cap on a mountaintop. I don't know. But this is the Mount of Olives. And that though there are many who argue for the concept of a crucifixion site right here very close to Jerusalem or on some other surrounding hill, there are some who make the case, again, very convincingly, that the actual site of the crucifixion may have been on the Mount of Olives itself, which when we go to Ezekiel 11, we have the glory of the Lord rising up from within the city, and it stopped on the mountain east of the city. That would be the Mount of Olives. So here we have the glory having departed from the temple, stopping here. What's going on here? But Jesus being rejected by this generation, and as he's tried in the precinct of Jerusalem, is then moved out of the city to be crucified or sacrificed outside the camp, as it were. And maybe on the city east of Jerusalem, per Ezekiel 11. But don't want to make too much of that as if to say it had to be that way just to fulfill what was going on here in Ezekiel 11. But then bridging this over here to Ezekiel 37 and John 20, starting with that first. After this, he said, rephrase that. After this, he breathed on them, and then he said, receive the Holy Spirit. Interesting, because here in Ezekiel 37, so as I prophesied as he commanded me, the breath entered to them. We have the prophet yielding the word of the Lord when these bodies had been reconstituted, starting with dry bones, then covering them with soft tissue, then flesh, but they're standing there as lifeless entities, waiting to be reanimated. And God, through a human agent, speaks life into them through his ruach, his life-giving spirit and breath that now enters them to make them a new humanity. And the idea is that the fulfillment of this starts with the first domino with the return of the exiles from Babylon. But that's only typologically speaking of the greater fulfillment of that reality over here in John 20, where we have the renewed Israel and the disciples in this upper room actually receiving the breath through God's prophet and the reanimation from life or lifelessness unto life. I meant to say death or lifelessness unto life. And so with that, I think you've seen here with all my scribbling, several poignant connections between John's gospel and Ezekiel's gospel. Again, the idea, going back to the title of this lesson, Jesus overall, and how to connect these passages from John 10 to Hebrews 1, 1 through 3. And the writer there in Hebrews 1, 1 through 3 is simply saying, in times past, God spoke to us through his prophets and so forth, but now he is speaking to us through his son. And of course, we, having beheld his glory, are supposed to listen to him and what he has to say, because he is superior over all. So hopefully that makes some sense. Moving on, I want to cover this one final lesson here with respect to the priesthood, because if you happen to catch this in time, this happens to be the lesson that we're going to be talking about this upcoming Sunday. I guess I didn't quite time this out as perfectly as I would have liked to, but that being said, hopefully a few of you will find it before we get to that moment. So this lesson is built off the idea of what's going on in Luke 4 that actually permeates the rest of Luke 4, all of Luke 5, and about the first 11 or so verses of Luke 6. All of these stories, as you see in these orange boxes, are all strung together for the sake of demonstrating what's announced here in Luke 4, when Jesus reads from the Isaiah scroll in that particular spot, chapter 61, where he, as the spirit bearer of Isaiah 11 and the spirit bringer of Isaiah 42 and 49 and beyond, is now acting as that agent who is going to inaugurate Messiah's Jubilee. That's a perpetual, never-ending Jubilee, and it starts with a spiritual release, just like the Day of Jubilee was with the Day of Atonement, inaugurating the full year of Jubilee, that then gives rise to a lesser principle of that's going to be more drawn out over the course of the year, the physical release, as goes debts forgiven, slaves released, and then enriched as they go, to then go back to their ancestral homelands and all the boundaries being reset and so forth. So after he announces his Jubilee and release, that's the basal principle we need to get, is release. As Isaiah speaks about this Jubilee, it's release from spiritual captivity, not just physical captivity, spiritual captivity. And the spiritual captivity in every one of these stories that come afterwards, with a demon-possessed man in spiritual darkness being set free, people who are oppressed because of various sicknesses, and again, more demonic possession here. And then we have a tax collector. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Here we have the first of Jesus' disciples, and perhaps one of the more well-known ones, Simon Peter, who admits he's not worthy of being in the Lord's presence. He thinks he's far from God, and rightly so, but Jesus ignores that, saying, don't be afraid. Instead, come follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. And he becomes a part of the first, I should say, the first of the disciples, he becomes part of a larger movement of 12 men representing a renewed Israel that is being spearheaded by the Messiah, the servant who will lead this renewed Israel to then lead the nations into reconciliation with God, bringing an end to all of the spiritual darkness that resides over the nations, a jubilee for all mankind. The next story is a man who is physically separated from everybody because of his leprosy, but then he's cleansed and restored properly, not only by Messiah, but then also proclaimed so by the priest. Then we have a paralytic's sins forgiven. We'll get to that in a second. Tax collector, Matthew, turned not only disciple, but then welcome to share a meal with Jesus, where the real lines of Israel's borders are drawn, not so much with land possessions, because if you're a true Israelite, then you are allowed to dine at the table of other people. If there's a reason that they have to cast you out, that's the first place you're going to fill it out, is you're not allowed to come and share meals with people in this more intimate setting. So in other words, a tax collector would not be invited into the home of anyone else, because they would feel that would be a defilement of their home, should they allow such to be the case. So they would defer at all costs to not let that happen. Jesus, sitting down with his other disciples or followers at a table filled with tax collectors, is scandalous to the nth degree in the minds of these Pharisees and scribes who witness it. But Jesus is releasing this man from their preconceived biases and his own sin, in the sense that he is exacting interest. I almost said insurance. Interest from his own countrymen through the taxes and debts he's collecting from other people to make himself wealthy. That's sinful. Being in league with Rome, on the other hand, is not, according to Scripture, but it is in the minds of these people per their teachers and the instructions they have given over the last few centuries. Then we have this question about fasting and the idea of, hey, righteous people fast. Why don't you and your disciples? You're a rabbi. You should be doing that and teaching your disciples to do the same. Even John the Baptist did that. Instead, he is reminding them He is the one who is going to bring the feast of Isaiah 25, where Israel and the nations are gathered together as one, and he is releasing them from the captivity of death, removing the shroud that blankets all the nations, wiping the tears from every eye as he vanquishes death. That's what is meant to be seen in the concept of all of these moments of dining or even fasting. He's there with them. Why fast? It's completely inappropriate, right? And then the story beginning chapter 6, before we completely shift themes altogether, and the idea that Jesus is the Lord of Sabbath. Now, you have to understand, to get to the year of Jubilee, we have 7 full cycles of 7 sabbatical years. 7th year is the sabbatical year. We get full 7 cycles of that to get to 49 years. And then the very next year is the 50th year, which we would call Jubilee, or the ultimate sabbatical year. Now, granted, the 49th year was a sabbatical year too. However, the 50th year is a greater expression of that, because the 49th year, like all the other sabbatical years that preceded it, is a downscale jubilee. Debts are temporarily suspended, but that's it. Come the actual 50th year, debts are full on cancel. Slaves are set free and again enriched as they go. Boundaries are reset, just like these people had waltzed into the land, conquered it, and then moved into their tribal allotments given to them by Joshua all those years before. So the idea is that Jubilee and the Sabbath rest all go hand in hand with each other, and Jesus is the Lord of Sabbath, who invites people to again feast, hence the rubbing of grain in between his hands to feed him and his disciples. It's a small feast, but the idea is that there's eating attached to this. And all of that points back to the original Sabbath setting in the garden, where God invited man to experience living with him in harmony, listening to his commands, basking in the light of his glory, imbibing of his wisdom, which leads to life and ultimately to rest. So backing up to this story of the paralytic, we go all the way up here to the top of the screen. So this perhaps firms this up more than anything else, because here we have a full breakdown and a moment where these two things are separated by a brief little lesson where Jesus first forgives this man or gives him a spiritual release. Remember, we've got to go back to Leviticus 25, where Jubilee is inaugurated first by the Day of Atonement, which ends the 49th year and begins the 50th year. I know it's the 10th day of the 7th month, but there are different calendars that Israel goes by. Civil year, the religious year, and they all have different New Year dates. Religious New Year begins here for these people. So with that in mind, the Day of Atonement brings about a spiritual release by the cleansing of the land of the people of their sins through their righteous mediator, the Adam priest king figure, working on their behalf inside the tabernacle temple setting. Then he gets a physical release because he is cleansed of his, or I should say, healed of his physical malady, that allows him to then take up his stretcher and go home, which is the fallout of what happens after the Day of Atonement, inaugurating the year of Jubilee, when the shofar horns are blown throughout the land, freedom and release is proclaimed throughout the land, which signals everybody now is the time. God has accepted the sacrificial offerings for the Day of Atonement. The land has been cleansed of her iniquity, and atonement. Atonement has been made. And by virtue of that, now comes the year-long process of setting everything back to its physical reset. So this man was given a spiritual release and reset, then a physical release and reset, for him to then follow the king, the Messiah, the Jubilee bringer, into his new Jubilee. All right, so that's where we'll end. We've got 2 more themes in our final session, which will be a total of 5. So I do appreciate your time. Thanks for listening.